is session 6 of our Fort Collins Issues Forum. And one of the things that we've been doing is looking at various aspects of our community. We all love to live here, and we know Fort Collins is a great place to live, but there are things that are going on that we all need to know about. And we've had Isaac, and we've had the Homeless Alliances come. And tonight we're very lucky to be able to have Police Chief Jeffrey Swoboda to talk to us about criminal justice in Fort Collins and all the things that the police department, their challenges, and all the programs that they've been implementing. And so I'm going to turn it over to him and let him get started. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate the offer to come here and speak tonight. I mentioned just a moment ago that I'd really like for this to be a kind of a dialogue versus me just standing and speaking about what I think you want to hear, and I'd much rather hear whatever you'd like. So in literally just a couple of minutes, I'll ask you to kind of give me a topic of what you want to learn more about, and we'll just start from there. But just a little bit about myself to start with. My name is Jeff Swoboda, and I've been here in Fort Collins for a little over 3 years, about 3.5 years. I came in June of 2018, and I come by way of just outside of Chicago, a town called Elgin, Illinois. For some of you might have heard of them. If there's old wristwatches, Elgin was one of the first cities, and they had a watch factory that talked about they timed. They made their mechanisms so that they were timed by the stars, and so they had a lot going on with that. So many times people recognize the name Elgin but don't know where that's from. So it's about 45 minutes outside of Chicago, and I started there as a police officer in 1992, and was there for 26 years. In the last 8 years, I was the chief of police. I rose through the ranks there. And then after about 26 years, I really just kind of looked around the country. I was looking for a new challenge, a new place to live. Loved my job. Loved the city, loved the people I worked with. But sometimes, and maybe some of you have felt this before, but I've felt I was ready for a new challenge and try something in a different part of the country. And looked around and was very specific with where I wanted to work, where I wanted to live. And probably like many of you saw Fort Collins, or if you grew up here, you don't realize it until you go around just how amazing Fort Collins is. And not just the area, but as I looked at the police department, it's just really an amazing organization. And so I was very excited and put in and got this job in June. So just give you a brief overview of the police department itself. There are 224 police officers, a little over 100 more of what we call professional staff, and so that's dispatchers, people work in the records department. We have community service officers that, unfortunately, if you're involved in a minor crash or things, they come out and take a police report, so they do a lot of work that doesn't need a police officer. I like to say, what are the calls for service that we need a gun and a badge and the powers of arrest to go to, and what are those calls for service that we don't need that to go to? And so we're working through that, and we'll start talking about that with mental health as well, which I'm sure is a topic we'll get to here in a little while. So that's the police department. We're divided up into, we have a patrol division, which are the officers that wear uniforms like this, and they drive black and white squad cars. We have a detective bureau that are, I'm sure everybody knows what detectives are, and they're mostly in unmarked vehicles. And then we have another unit called Special Operations, and that is our K-9 unit, our SWAT team, our school resource officers, there's a bomb team, there is probably missing one, our special events. So if, when there's a large event coming, we have one group that just works on the security of things like that. Around the country, especially over the past few years, there's been some really high-profile incidents that are occurring at these, so we spend a lot of time and energy to make sure that these events go off safely. And so that's the special operations. Then we have an administrative, I have one deputy chief, and he runs our training division. And so our training really is about who we're bringing in, how we're hiring them. I'll talk about it in a little bit. I won't go into it now, but we just launched our new police academy. So Fort Collins is really rare and very blessed to have our own police academy. And in the past, what would happen is we'd send people off to academies. It could be what's called like Flat Rocks, which is down closer to Denver. There's a couple different ones around the state. And they would go there for anywhere between 18 and 21 weeks. Some of the academies were a little shorter or longer than the others. And then they would come back to us. And what that training did, it was training from all many different police departments, from sheriff's offices to small departments to bigger departments. And what we found is some of the things that were being taught there really weren't in line with what we wanted police to be here in Fort Collins. We really, and I'm really talking a lot about peace officers, less about police officers and more about peace officers. And so some of the things that were taught there, by no means quote unquote bad or out of line, but just a different philosophy with some and use of force and things like that. So we worked really hard, and we just launched our own academy. We just graduated 10 young officers from our Fort Collins Police Academy #1, and so we're really excited about that. And the last piece I'll talk about just as an intro before I open it up for questions is we just have our own training center. Fort Collins, again, is just so forward thinking, and for years they talked about having our own training academy. It was very difficult to get officers the training they needed, whether that was driving a car, whether that was an indoor firing range, whether that was rooms to just come in and talk, or defensive tactics, things like that. And we partnered with Loveland about 3 or 4 years ago, and really, no, probably longer than that, 5 or 6 years ago, and got all the powers that be to agree to each put in about $10 million, and it's a $20 million facility that's over there off of, right by the airport. It's actually on the airport property. And so if anybody, and I'll say this now so that in case I forget to say it later, that academy or the training center or police services, if anybody ever wants a tour or wants to learn more, or you've got another group that you belong to that you'd love to have us come out, myself or someone else, or you all come. I talked earlier, I have a hard stop at around 7 o'clock because we have another group there. It's got a CityWorks unit, which is really different people from the city come and talk, and they learn about all the things that are going on in the entire city, because there's a lot of things going on. And so we have a presentation there tonight. But we do the presentations, every week there's something going on. So if there's something more we can do, or you'd like to learn more, please let us know. So I think I'll just open it up. I've got a variety of things. If there aren't any questions, I could go on and on. No problem for me to fill the time, but I, again, would rather hear what you'd like me to talk about. So we're just going to start right off the bat. And if it's not a question, if it's just, can you tell us a little more about X, we can hop right into that. So maybe, are there any questions yet? Or should I just, yes, looks like there's a couple.
So part of the motivation for this whole series we're doing is our interest in racial justice issues in the community, and obviously police have been at the center of that conversation here, particularly in the last couple of years. Can you say a little bit about what the department's doing, maybe some of the things that are working well on that front, and also some of the things that are maybe still roadblocks or stumbling blocks?
Yeah, so I love that the microphone, so I don't have to repeat the question. So thank you very much for that. So there's a lot going on, and so I would probably start with, just because I had a meeting 2 mornings ago, we brought together the city just hired someone who is focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and she would be a great person to come here and talk. But we had a meeting, and we brought in Poudre School District, and we brought in our restorative justice program that the city has, which, for those of you who don't know, it's for juveniles. And if there are minor violations, thefts, it can be graffiti or things like that, we bring people in, and there's everything from peace circles, they're called, and a lot of restorative measures that they talk about. There are peers involved that they look at it, and so it was a great one. And so I tell that we had that meeting just to talk about what we're really looking at is not just the police department, but what is the city doing, and what are we as a community doing. And there's so many people doing so much, and it's work that is obviously very important. It's on everyone's mind, and we're behind the times in policing. It's one of the first things is we are really working hard to be a community that looks like a police department that looks like our community. But what's interesting in Fort Collins, that bar is pretty low, because diversity is not in Fort Collins, not a ton of diversity. So, for instance, talk just about people want to be police officers who are black, and that number for and I haven't checked it here in the past weeks or months. So the number we always go off is less than 2%, somewhere around 1.5%. Well, at the size of a police department, that would mean that we would need, if we had 5 people who were black out of 224, we're good. We mirror our community. Well, I think most people would say, the point of diversity isn't just a static number. It's what are the perspectives? Where are people located in the organization so that they can have more of a say and actually have these discussions? So we're working really hard on that. We're also looking, and we have a transparency page that I spend a lot of time talking about. If you haven't done it yet, if you go to our website, and it's basically the landing page, there's I think you'll see like a body camera, and it just says Fort Collins transparency page. The transparency page is every time, especially over the past 2 years or so, we were getting a lot of questions about, what's happening with this. After the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot of questions of like, could that happen here? How was our police department trained? Do you do this? Do you do that? And so what we started doing was capturing all of those, and then rather than just answering a bunch of people's questions, we put those questions up. We obviously scrubbed what, the person who asked it, but we knew a lot of people were asking about chokeholds. We knew a lot of people were asking about, there were various different programs that were going on called My Brother's Keeper or 8 Can't Wait. The President Obama had a challenge with police. So there were a lot of things, and so we would answer those questions and we put it up. People are asking the diversity of our police department, who are we writing tickets to for speeding, who is getting arrested, and so we are putting all of that up as part of a transparency page. So I'd encourage everyone to go. And so the work is always occurring though, because as we're looking at it, we'll have percentages that are higher than the actual, the representation here in Fort Collins. And so then and I like to say data is a great place to start discussions. It doesn't end them right there, and where you can, some try to end the conversation right there and say, look at this means you're doing something wrong, look at this number, versus let's unpack that a little bit, let's look at it, and we've, as a city, we employed a group called City University of New York. It was the Cooney Institute, CUNY, and they really came in and looked at use of force, ticketings, and then put those numbers in perspective based on the population. And so it did come out that we were using force on people of color at a higher level. Ticketing was also there. And so we have been having those conversations internally as well and looking at that. Part of it then is also dissecting it. It's like, okay, well, we will many times look at who we write tickets to or who we arrest and then compare that to the population. Well, what we're finding as well is we're continuing to learn and dig through this. Well, the people we're writing tickets to and arresting aren't always from here. They could be transients that are just coming through. They could be people coming to cruise up and down College Avenue from all over. I mean, it's far away from many different counties away that come here because Fort Collins has, the college campus, and so young men and women are coming and hanging out, and many maybe in this room as well have cruised in their lifetimes as well. And what we'd been working on recently was really just the idea of, it's not the cruising, it's the criminal stuff that comes after that. So we're making a ton of traffic stops, we're finding people with alcohol, we make arrests and things like that. Well, it's people who aren't even from this community. So now we're trying to dive in and say, okay, how do we look at that? We look at our use of force, and I can think of one case where I think it was a year ago where there was a large use of force in a large fight, and use of force was used on multiple people. And in that fight, there were multiple people of color. And they were individuals who came down from, I think, an Air Force base over the border. And so, again, we're always looking at this and who are we interacting with? Why doesn't it match? Okay, let's take a step back. Let's compare it to our population, but then let's look and see. And so we're using the data really to be a great starting point to have conversations. And then my last point I'll put on that is we just launched about 3 months ago, and actually, Pastor here is on with us. It's our Chiefs Community Advisory Committee. And we're coming in and throwing out all the numbers and basically help us understand this as well, because we can look at it and explain it away or say this is the reason that, and what we want is perspective. And so while we don't always have a great deal of diversity inside the organization, just by how people look, we have a lot of diversity based on where people are coming from. Are they military or not? We have adopted people. We have people who grew up single-family home. I mean, there's a great deal of diversity inside Fort Collins Police Services, but when you just look at what people look like, male, female, are they, what color are they Latinx, those numbers we're continuing to work on. So we're asking for perspective on how do we do this, because right now it's a challenging time to get anybody to want to be a police officer, and it's even a little bit more of a challenge to get people of color who want to be a police officer because of some of the issues that we're hearing about and seeing in really around the world. And so we're working on it. We're doing a ton with it, and we recognize it's bigger than us. And when we're dealing with things, with whether we're talking about racism, whether we're talking about how people treat, are they mentally stable, all that, we get police officers from the community, from this community. And we do get people from other communities that want to come here. We're a destination police department. But we're dealing with all of the issues that people come with their own, whether it's their own personal bias, whether it's issues that they bring along with them, whether it's mental health. And so we're working through all of that with the police officers we have. The number one thing we can do, though, is and we've really been working on this, is let's just be honest with our folks. Let's put the data out there. Let's be allowed to ask hard questions. And I had somebody say from our equity and inclusion office a while ago, when I was trying to struggle with some of the numbers and saying, okay, how do we work through this? And she would say, Jeff, you don't need to have an answer. Society doesn't have an answer to any of this stuff right now. You as a police chief can't just have an answer to why things are the way they are. Everyone's working through this. The real power is going to be in, are you open to having conversations? Are you open to learning? Are you open to continuing to give that? And so we're working very hard in that space because we know right now that's where a lot of the work is at. You're welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. Can you tell us a little bit about the diversity of the force? Are we paying our officers enough? Are we training them enough? And what kind of attrition do you see?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. We are a very well-paid. We are well-resourced within the organization. I mean, you've seen it. We have a beautiful building. Our squad cars are not falling apart. Our officers' uniforms are sharp when they go out. I mean, we are well-resourced. I always like to say, like any organization, or any of you, or spouses, or kids, they come home from work and they say how busy they were, need more people, or, that's many things. Well, that's the same in policing. So we're having a lot of conversations around what are the things that we want, as I mentioned at the very beginning, what are the things people need a police officer to show up for, and then what are the things they don't? And how do we then bring the community along so that we don't just say we're no longer coming? It's, hey, we're not sending a police officer out for that. Here are the options that you have. I like to say I can go and go to DIA tonight and book a flight and travel around the world and not talk to a single person. The TSA agent will look at my ID and things, but I don't need to talk to anybody. I can, if I want to sit on the plane and have a drink, I can do it just on my phone and it comes to me. And so, but in policing, we're still in this kind of idea that if something happens to someone, they call 3 numbers, and a police officer, no matter where they're at in the city, will drive across town and talk to that person. They'll tell them what happened, and then the police officer goes back and writes that out. And majority of the time, especially if things are slow and the people are not backed up, there's not a huge issue with that. But as we continue to grow and officers get very busy with their time and the city is expanding, many people are, whether, probably for a variety of reasons over generations, not as willing, they don't feel as safe going to their neighbor if something's going on and telling them to knock it off or asking them to do something. They call us instead. So in many ways, policing has become the place where everyone goes if there's anything going on in their little area, in their neighborhood, on their block type of thing. So we could always use more people, but even in this budget that's coming up, we have 6 more police officers coming on. Of those 6, I'm very happy to report that 5 of them are in the area of mental health. We're hiring a sergeant and 4 officers just for mental health. And, this is probably one of I think one of the best things we're doing right now. We're doing a lot of really good things with training in our own academy, and but this idea of mental health, the motto we have here in Fort Collins is we bring the police officers, and UC Health, who's a great partner, they bring the mental health professional. They pay for that. So, through this whole discussion of defund the police, while some were really about, defunding the police or abolishing police, the majority of things that I heard were about, let's put some money into social services. Let's make sure that we don't need to send a police officer to someone sleeping in a park potentially. So how do we do that? And to me, that wasn't necessarily defund the police, but it was talking about how much money do we have and resourced out. So we are not building our budget or what we're doing inside Fort Collins Police Services based on mental health. We're bringing the police officers, and UC Health is bringing the co-responders. So, I mean, that's a huge help for us because that gets very expensive. But they recognize that every time we go out on a call and we're able to help someone and they can stay in place, or we can get them straight to services and do a warm handoff to a third party, a nonprofit, something like that, and they don't go to, we don't call for an ambulance, and then they don't go to the emergency room, they are saving a lot of money. And so they recognize that. And so they said, you know what, we're going to partner with you. And the other piece that really makes Fort Collins Police Services unique with mental health in our co-response program, we call it our mental health response team, is there's a community paramedic. And what the community paramedic brings to this is, so when there's a call for service, an officer goes, or if a dispatch recognizes, you know, there's something going on here, it could be someone threatening suicide, we're not sure what's going on, it could be a parent calling on their son or daughter, and you know, there's clearly some kind of mental health component with it. We can, many times a patrol officer will go first, but our mental health team will be, you know, pretty close there behind. And our mental health team is able to go out while a crisis is occurring and talk to them and say, okay, here's what, you know, hopefully you get a nice peaceful resolution to this. And the officer is there to make sure, hey, you know, everyone is safe. The co-responder is there, the mental health professional is there to say, hey, you know, talk to me, what's going on? What happened today? Why, you know, how are things going for you? And they're able to work that angle. And then the community paramedic is there to say, you know what, where's that bruise on your arm? Where'd that come from? You know, can I see the medications you're taking? Let's see, are they interacting with each other? What are your doses? When was the last time you saw your doctor? Hey, can I take your blood pressure? Can I take your pulse? You seem really, you're sweating a lot. What's that? That team together, I mean, it sounds like a bad joke, you know, a cop, a social worker, and a paramedic walk into a house. But it really is such a unique team, and all we bring to the table in Fort Collins is the police officer. Many departments are growing their police department because there isn't a partner like we have at UC Health. And then the last piece with that, what I'm really proud about, and I met with the Attorney General today and the mayor, because they're looking at Fort Collins really as a model around the city, from how we're training our officers with the idea of empathy, leading with empathy, and then how we're making it this idea of peace officers. Sure, we're always going to need to shoot, we're always going to need to drive, we're always going to need to learn how to handcuff people, but the majority of time we can have these conversations, and actually if we take our time and we recognize what are triggers for people and how things are going, and if we have a team there, and if we have a relationship, hopefully things don't get up to where we then have to use force and then have to use handcuffs and things like that. So this idea of a police officer, the mental health professional, and the community paramedic is really something I just talked about it to city managers around the country, actually, truly around the world, because it's an international conference and it was in Portland. And I went and did a presentation, and we also talked to it at Colorado Municipal League, and we talked about it with elected officials and city managers around Colorado. And so it's a really, really cool thing that's going on here right now, and it's in the budget next year that we can double the size of the program so that we can then have 7 days a week coverage for 20 hours a day is what we're looking at. It's not going to be 24 hours a day because there's a few hours there's an overlap because we're only going to have 6 people working. So we're working through that, but we're excited. I'm not sure if I totally answered your question as far as, you know, how many people, the resources. One of the biggest things we work on and we look at is our response time. When someone, the biggest reason we pay for police officers, when I need help now, how quickly can you get here? And so those are what we call priority 1 calls. We are benchmark cities, which are 29 other cities that we compare ourselves to with a lot of data. They're right at 5.5 is the kind of the goal. We've been hovering right around 4 minutes. Our goal is to continue to drive down and beat even our benchmark cities. So our officers, our dispatchers are doing a fantastic job making sure that when it's that real important call here, someone's in my house, someone's, you know, attacking my son or daughter out in the front yard, I was just in a bad crash, or there was just a bad crash, clearly someone is injured, how quickly can we get there? And then those smaller calls, they do have to wait sometimes, so they go. And my last point I'd like to make on that is if you ever find yourself, unfortunately, having to call 911, please know that the person you're talking to is not the person that's talking to the officers. And so many times when things happen and I go back and I listen to the call, there's a lot of frustration when someone's on there and there's a lot of questions being asked. You know, you find a loved one who's not breathing and they're asking a lot of questions. You know, what's their name? How old are they? What's the address? Obviously, one of the first things we want to know. that person is typing it in, it's a computer-aided dispatch, and it's being sent over to another person who's talking to the officer, and they're reading what's in front of them. It's a much more efficient way than talking to you, talking to the officer, talking to you, and so many times people get very frustrated thinking, just enough with the questions, but every question we get is helping them, and many times to be able to determine, can they give you enough information for you to successfully do some CPR or things like that. So there are sometimes some questions that people are wondering about, history of things, like, why do you care about history? Right now he's not breathing or she's not breathing, I need help. Well, they're trying to figure out, have we been here before? What was it the last time? How can we help you in that space? So we're trying to get better with technology. We're trying to get better with how we're responding to calls for service and bring the community along, and it's going to be something we will definitely keep the community notified, because we're not just going to tell people we're not going to things anymore. We're going to tell them how they can accomplish what they want, because a great deal of what police officers do, quite honestly, is write police reports for insurance companies. And so that's why we do many times the car crashes, the damage to mailboxes, the broken windows. It's a police report that eventually gets sent off so people can get insurance. They're not, unless there's a pattern and we think we have a good witness who's going to do something, the random BB hole in a window, unless we know the neighbor just got a BB gun and has been out in the front yard, and we kind of, we call that a clue that might be, what something's going on here. Generally speaking, there's not a whole lot of investigations that go into those calls. We're writing police reports so that people can get reimbursed from their insurance companies. Yes, ma'am.
Just to follow up on that, with all of the pressures that your officers are under, do you have the mental health support for them? I love that you have the mental health support planned for the community. I think that's great. Can you talk a little bit about, is there an EAP that they have access, or I just worry about them sometimes.
Yeah, well, thank you for your concern and the question. Again, what this city has done and being forward thinking, 30 years ago, they hired a psychologist to work inside the police department. And that has been so helpful in so many ways, and really set the groundwork so that when we're introducing these new programs like a mental health response team, the officers that were there are so comfortable with the idea of mental health and how we all need to take care of ourselves in order to take care of the community, that it wasn't a foreign concept. I tell people, and again, I told the Attorney General today, because there's this big push for more mental health response or more co-responders out there. You drop a co-responder into a police department that's not prepared for that is not thinking along those lines about mental health, they won't be accepted. Police officers won't want them in the cars with them. It could be a challenge. Our organization, again, for 30 years has been talking about mental health, and right now it's Dr. Dan Dworkin, who's been here 20 years, and there was somebody who was here 10 years before him. And I can tell you for the last 20 years, Dr. Dan has really pushed this idea of peer support, and actually has laws enacted because of the work that we were doing here in Fort Collins decades ago, and talks about what is peer support, what can officers talk about, what is confidential. Police officers, like anybody, if they're going to say something that's going to potentially cost them their livelihood, they're not going to talk. So how do we make sure that what they say is confidential? Unless, of course, it crossed a line and there's a law broken or something like that, or someone's in danger, then there are ways out in which information can be let go. But generally speaking, how do they talk about the fact that, I'm depressed, I'm not feeling good, I'm going through a divorce, my child is sick? If they think that, then the chief's going to come in the next day and take their gun and put them on the desk and say, I heard you talk to the psychiatrist, you know what, you can't be on the street, you're not. So we're talking about that. As we talk about mental health, we're really looking at a lot of times as you look at in some of the big conversations that are being had around the country around use of force. Many times use of force, and especially if it's an inappropriate use of force, if you follow that officer back, the previous call or two previous calls ago, many times were very significant calls. I know I've looked at some where use of force, and not just here in Fort Collins, but around the country. An officer used force inappropriately, and then you look at the last call they were at, it was a death of a child. It was somebody where they were giving CPR. You see police officers, they go from one call of a nothing call of a minor fender bender where they wrote a report to someone with a gun, to then go to the school to talk to whoever, to then go, it talks about, adrenaline up and then adrenaline dumps and how long it takes for adrenaline to work its way through the body. And so there's a ton of information that's out there. And so what we've talked a lot about, we don't have it down perfect yet, but making sure that after officers are on kind of really serious calls, really ones that made their heart rate go up and and might kind of be messing with them a little bit in their head. You know, they're not sure if the child they just gave CPR to is going to live or not, but he's at the hospital or she's at the hospital. And so, okay, I'm back, I'm clear. Okay, go to this next call. And so, you know, from a rudeness complaint to an officer being short with someone to use of force, all those things. So we're really pushing this idea that after any one of those calls where we can recognize that that really could have been a troublesome one for the officer, let's take them out of service for a little bit. Let's take them out for even, because we can't do it for like the rest of the day, but for 15 minutes, you know, go get some coffee, go take a break. You don't have to go right back into service, because we're seeing that. The fire department has seen this for years. I know after many traumatic calls that they go on, they can take an entire unit out of service. But the part that they have is then they can all talk to each other. You know, an officer is back in his squad car or her squad car by themselves and thinking about what just happened. Could I have done that better? Could I have done that different? And so really working through that is so important, because when you look at the outcome, I tell people all the time, and it's a little bit off subject, but we have all these societal failures out there, from undiagnosed mental health to poverty to racism to education, all these things, and not all in the exact same order, but a lot of times failures as a society where we haven't done our own. And then we send a 22-year-old police officer at 2 o'clock in the morning with zero resources, because there's nobody working, it's just us, it's just the cops. Firemen are sleeping. That's a joke. It's a 22-year-old out there trying to figure out what's going on. And then it ends poorly, and people say, look how that officer handled it. How, you know, it's a 22-year-old who we gave a gun, a badge, a ticket book to, some handcuffs. We gave him 40 hours of training on mental health. And then he's being dropped into a house potentially that for generations has had issues with trying to figure out what's going on and how they work through it. And then the police officers there trying to work through that, and it doesn't go perfectly, and people then go and question the police. I'm all for that. I'm all about, hey, we got to make sure our officers are doing how we're trained. But I think it's many times really easy for people to go to police officers and say, we need to reform the police. Hey, I'm there. If we're using force inappropriately, I'd say the same thing. If police officers are crossing the line, you know, they need to go to jail, they need to be arrested. I'm good with that. But at some point, we need to swim upstream a little bit further and see, as a society, how have we failed our communities when we've just closed mental health institutions, because many times for very good reasons, because we're just going to, in the community, then they'll just go to the doctor, they'll be medicated, everything will be fine. Well, when they're not, and then we have things like homelessness and mental health and addiction all occurring at the same time, and then what do you do with that problem? Well, of course, you call the police, and they'll come and figure it out. And so I just think as we're having these conversations, it's one of the things I really love about Fort Collins, how smart it is. I really do think if we're going to solve some of these really big issues as a society, I think when communities start figuring out, I think Fort Collins will be on that fronting edge of it, because not only are we caring, we're educated, we love making our city better. In some places, what I see, and it can happen from time to time, even here, where let's just point it at the officer and say, you know, officer did wrong. We need to hold that officer accountable. Yeah, we probably do. I mean, if he's crossing the line, he's not following his training. But can we swim upstream a little bit further and see what happened the past 10 years when this person was suffering from mental health and couldn't get help because they didn't have insurance, or couldn't get a place to go live because we didn't have any affordable housing and all the other places were full, and the shelters are full right now because of COVID, so they can't go and sleep there. So there's just a lot bigger issues than just police. So if I'm on a soapbox, I apologize, but I just always surprised when we have these issues and people go right to the cop and can't, because some are obvious though, right? A police officer crossed the line, does something inappropriate, and we all look at it and say, that's wrong. Yes, absolutely. But there are many other times where people just don't like it. I can tell you with like use of force, I've been in this career 30 years, and I've been a police officer or police chief for 10 years, and I've seen, you know, I don't know how many use of forces in person, body camera, other kind of video. Use of force never looks pretty. It never looks good. It's not a Steven Seagal movie where we use the person's body and then just gently bring them down. It's always usually a fight. It's if I'm one grown man trying to take another grown man into custody, and at some point I have to control him with one arm as I pull back to get my handcuffs to put his arms behind his back and handcuff him, while someone is wildly fighting me, it is ugly. And so I do think that the more conversations we have, the more people learn about policing. I think we can have these discussions, and because, as I always say, and I'm in this boat too, I get to review that call for service the next day with a cup of coffee to my side, sitting in probably a comfortable chair in a very climate-controlled environment, and now I'm going to be judging how that officer did or didn't do. And I just think that, especially in Fort Collins, because we kind of get this, I think we can really elevate the conversation. It's definitely something I'm pushing as well. It's not defending bad behavior, but it's definitely saying when it doesn't go perfectly well, I mean, there are certain things that can still be trainable, that everything is not the biggest issue in the world when it comes to policing, and there are some that anytime an officer does something even remotely inappropriate, it's let's fire him, let's get rid of him. And it's, there does need to be a reasonable approach at some point to say, what was that? Why did that happen? Is it trainable? Is it a character flaw? Let's look at those types of things. But it's there's a lot going on in policing right now, and so we are looking at mental health of our officers as well, because we're also looking at who we bring in. We don't want to bring in somebody who's been a problem in another place and getting fired, and that's happened in policing many, many times over the years. A lot of changes have come where I think that's going to come to an end, because we have to identify people we fire now so that any officer can check that list, or any department can check that list to make sure that if Swoboda was fired from this department and for some reason they just want to get rid of him, they don't, the old, I don't know what I can say because I don't want him to come back and suing me personally, so people don't ever say he was a bad employee or what have you. They just kind of sit quietly, and if it's not spelled out in the personnel file, many times officers can sneak through and get into another police department job, even though they just tarnished the badge at the last place. Well, this new list that's being created, and really I think it's already created, is going to, I think, put an end to that, where then people have to be identified. And if a department hires somebody off that list, they're going to have a lot of explaining to do. And I don't even think they can hire somebody off that list because they won't be able to be certified. A lot said there. Hopefully I answered a question or two in that. I'll try to keep my answers shorter going forward.
I have a question about how much judgment or leeway an officer has when they come upon something that is clearly wrong. I am thinking of the older woman in Loveland, Karen Garner, I think it was, or the young woman in Old Town who was intoxicated and inappropriate. Are there strict rubrics that a officer has to follow, like if this or this or this happens, you have to do something, or can some judgment let the mixed up lady with $3 of flowers just go home?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's growing as the amount of judgment that people have. But I think we need to, and I say we, police chiefs in Fort Collins, what we need to do is make sure we continue to tell our officers that. What I continuously tell our officers is, you're the CEO of your company, your name, your brand, your reputation, you're the CEO. If you are ever on a call for service where it's no longer making sense what we're doing, in policing and probably in life, you can think of ideas where, momentum has brought you to a place where you never necessarily meant to get. And you make a decision based on what the last decision was. And so that all makes sense. But too often we don't say, well, where I'm at now, let me tie that back to where I actually started, not just my last decision. And so when we do that, there are many times where you'll look at it and be like, oh yeah, this case really is only this, and what am I about to do? So I think it's really important that we continue to do that. And so discretion is absolutely something that every officer has. There are certain things that, and this isn't the point of your question, but that are mandatory. If there's a domestic violence and we see that somebody was abused, there are certain things when we have to make arrests and things. But generally speaking, and I tell our officers this all the time, police officers right now are not getting in trouble for what they're not doing. They're getting in trouble for what they are doing. And so if we're going to err on this, police officers, these are people's careers. It's my career. It's other people and families and livelihoods that are there. So there is a part of it where you have to take just a completely objective look at what you're doing. And so in Portland, I can't remember what it was. There was a city where two factions are continuously fighting. And there's a lot of questions about why aren't the police doing anything? And you're starting to hear commentators and things say, why would the police do it? Here are two groups that are showing up purposely to fight each other. There's no innocent people that are being caught in the middle of this. And if a police officer goes out there and has to use force, which clearly if they're fighting, there's going to be some level of use of force, and then if somebody gets hurt, the lawsuits, and then now where if you use force inappropriately, depending on what it is, you have your career stripped from you. You can be decertified. And so there's just a lot of questions when we, there used to be, calls for service where I can think back to someone threatening to harm themselves, to kill themselves, and police officers, keep pushing through, and they eventually get into, the bedroom and someone's got a gun, and the police officer shoots him because, they can do that quicker than the officer can draw, or the person makes a movement. And so we're now having questions of, why are we pushing through to that? Of course we want to help that person, but they're going to make a decision that they're going to make, and as policing, we probably don't need to be in that room. We can offer services, and a lot of people don't even like hearing that, but I'll tell you right now, our department, and I am encouraging as we talk to people, we are not going to push through and push someone into a decision, whether it's suicide by cop or now we're pushing it to a level. If someone wants to harm themselves, many times, not all times, many times, we're leaving resources there, we're calling and leaving messages, we're letting loved ones know, and we're clearing the call. We're not going to empty out an apartment complex because Jeff is in his room and wants to harm himself, and we're not sure if he has a gun, and how far do we push those calls? And I'm not sure it's a positive move in policing, but it's definitely in line with police officers who are pushing calls for service to a certain level where then they're being held accountable for what happens at that level. So hopefully that's making sense as far as there's a level where a police officer comes in and they have no choice but to defend themselves or other people and have to take action. That's one thing. There's another thing if someone is around the corner and there's nobody else there that they could harm but themselves, and I push forward and I go further, and then I harm that person. There's a lot of discussion that, well, why did you go down there? In policing, we say a lot of times, well, somebody has to do something, and I can routinely now say, I'm not sure about that anymore. There's a person yelling at the stop sign right now. He's screaming at it. People are well-intentioned. They're driving by and saying, hey, police, there's a guy yelling at the stop sign. Well, I'm not sure that that's a police call anymore. Because when we show up, if he's agitated and he comes at the officer and the officer has to tackle the person and put him on the ground and an arm is broken, the story will be the person wasn't harming anyone. The officer showed up, put him on the ground, broken arm, serious bodily injury. That's very bad. An officer, in today's day and age, an officer now could be personally held responsible at some level, could lose their career. And so what we're trying to do now is find partners out there. And we've got a great one here in Fort Collins, Outreach Fort Collins, which does a great job. The problem is that they don't have enough people to cover the whole city. But we refer a lot of those calls to Outreach Fort Collins, which aren't just the uniform itself can set many people off, because if you're homeless, if you're mentally ill, if you're addicted, if things are going on to the point where you're yelling at a stop sign, well, the last time you interacted with the police, was it good or was it not? There's a good chance that maybe it wasn't. Maybe you went to the hospital against your will. Maybe you got arrested. Who knows? And so just even have an officer walk up to talk to that person. I've been on many calls where it's a nothing. I'm going to walk up to the person and be like, hey, knock it off. Can't do that. You got to leave. Not the stop sign scenario, but anything else. And it turns into a fight. The person just immediately, they're not thinking clearly. They see the uniform. And so we're now looking at, and I'm looking at, how do I protect our officers? Yes, that person needs help, but it might not be the police that do that. And so as we're talking going forward about mental health and who do we send to calls for service, there's a lot to be said about it doesn't need to be the police, clearly. But I ask you, at 2 a.m, when a father is having a problem with his 15-year-old son, and the 15-year-old son is now big enough where he can fight dad and beat him up, and it's just a mental health issue, who are they going to call? There's nobody for that family to call generally at 2 a.m. They're going to call the police. So we are either not going, or we're going and trying to slow roll that. Doesn't mean we run in and kick in the door and create an altercation. But there's just a lot easier when you hear people come to the kind of the quick and easy solution, which is no solution at all. Just send a social worker. On its very face, it's not even a serious response, because if you talk to social workers, they don't want to go up and knock on a door with nobody around them for the person who wants to hurt themselves They're not going to go and just knock on the door. Hi, I'm Sally, and I'm here, or I'm Jim, and I'm here to help you, and the person's got a weapon. So the idea of just sending social workers, whenever you hear that phrase, it's almost laughable because it's just not based in any reality. If you talk to social workers who are doing this work, they say, I'm not going up, and then I'm not going into their house to help them. I need a police officer there. So it's, yes, a social worker and a police officer. That's what's really working really well. And I know looks like there was been a waiting patiently. Thank you.
I was just wondering what we could do as a faith community or as a community to help you in what you are doing very well.
You know, I'm not shy to say prayers. I know many times people ask, can they pray for, I've had people, can I pray for you? Absolutely. You know, so I think hosting things like this, I like to say I like difficult questions. And I'm finding more and more, it could be with age or just there are very few right answers. Like, I don't even deal in the world of a right answer or a wrong answer. There are perspectives, and there's judgment calls, and there's people trying to make the best decision they can. And so I would say, you know, having more discussions like this, and again, and if you have another group that wants to be involved, or you say, you know what, my son or my grandson has a, you know, what are the little Cub packs? What are they? Boy Scouts or what have you? Will you come and speak to them? You know, opening up for more opportunities, but then not being shy because it's not offensive at all to ask tough questions. You know, what's going on with that call for service? I saw in video how that was handled, and I disagree with it. And we'll talk about it, and at the end, you may not even agree with it at that point, but maybe you'll understand, okay, I understand why the officer said this or did that type of thing, but I still don't agree with it. I don't, you know, sometimes you'll never agree with it. It's like, no, clearly that was a crime. Other times it might be, yeah, I don't like the way that was handled. Let's talk about, you know, what is the training? I think those types of opportunities are so important. I would say, you know, this city is like many, so it's not struggling at a greater level than any other city. But it's struggling with homelessness and people who are sometimes, you know, they just kind of traveling through and going through town, and it's going to be cold weather. So I don't know what each church does for the other, you know, like opening up doors and doing things, and I'm not suggesting this turns into a shelter by any means, and then they have the health department or whoever else come after. The chief said we should open up and become a homeless shelter. But I think as much as helping and solving those areas, because that is something we're seeing a lot. The people who are experiencing homelessness, and I've had professionals who would disagree with me, but from what my officers are saying and what I have personally experienced, the vast majority are dealing with, they're addicted, they are mentally ill at some level, they're undiagnosed, they need some help. It's not just I lost my job, if only I had a job, I would be off. I mean, there are significant mental health and addiction issues, and you know, I think many well-intentioned people are making decisions, but there are decisions being made that let's reduce the crime of having drugs. And at a human level, that makes sense. Like, do we want our jails filled up with people who are just addicted? And I think most people would say no. But is the alternative more humane to say we're not going to leave you in jail, so you just go sleep over here and then go and steal and then, you know, live a life of never getting that help and that counseling? I can tell you, and I've had people who work in the jail tell me the same thing, that in jail, many times people are at their lowest point, and then they get the help that they need. So the consequences, and like I said, it's definitely not a political issue, but it's not even a critique. It's just, as we think through these things, yes, let's not have our jails filled with people who are mentally ill. Agreed. So do we have our people under our bridges filled with people who are mental? Where are they going? Where do they get the help that they need? And so I agree, jail is not the place, but what is? And so I think there's a lot, as I talk with people and read or watch TV, there's a lot of quick fixes, you know, clear out the jails. Okay, clear out the jails. No, it's not as if everyone now has a job and is going back and is now, you know, a contributing member of society. There are people who need help. And that's where I see people falling through. I had an officer tell me just recently that they arrested somebody for stealing or something, and the person was like, you know, was just admitting it and was like, I just need help. And so they brought them to the jail knowing that, hey, there are services they can get. Within an hour or so, they're back in Old Town, and they're like, what's going on? And the person was crying, being like, you know what, I can't, you know, I'm not going to be held based on what I've done. And so so what do we do with that? Where does that person get the help? So I would just think, like I said, there's not a smarter community that I know than Fort Collins. So what do we do with people like that? Because we all agree they shouldn't be filling up our jails. But what do you do with someone with an undiagnosed mental health who's sleeping under the bridge tonight? And this city passed that tax, which I think is going to be a huge benefit, I think 2 years ago or so, and it's going to be built next year, the mental health facility that's coming out of the county. I mean, those are huge moves that I think are going to help us out a lot. But I would say the addiction, the mental health, the homelessness, that then is some of the issues with the routine stealing at the large retail stores and things like that, or the fights or the disruptive behavior. Those are some of the things I think we need the biggest help with. We'll do the heavy lifting of the robberies and the other stuff, but those are some of the places we need some help with. I see a lot of movement. I must have talked a lot. Did I talk a lot? Oh, that's it. Oh, well, thank you very much. I'll gladly come back if asked.
Thanks, Chief. We've had a great relationship with the police department, your D1 officers here in the neighborhood, who have just been really great to work with. Lots of folks that we encounter on our campus, being a downtown church, and that provides wonderful opportunities for us to do outreach, to get to know people, to provide connections to the resources that they need. And Outreach Fort Collins has been a great help. I know they have a new director. We're looking forward to working with him. So thanks. It's good to know that we have good community partners. Next Wednesday night, we'll be back at 6 o'clock. Whitney Reed, who is the McKinney-Vento resource officer for the Poudre School District, will be with us. You heard the chief talk about some of the challenges, people living in poverty, people who are experiencing mental illness, and certainly our McKinney-Vento intervention staff in the school district are often connecting with families and with students, sometimes without families, who are facing some of those challenges. And so it'll be great to hear from Whitney next week. Again, thanks, Lynn, for helping to put all this together. And while the chief did have to go because he's rushing to another event, let us close with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we are so grateful for the opportunity to gather tonight. We give thanks for so many people who are working in public service on behalf of our community, and for our police officers who pledge to protect and serve. We know that they are often in very difficult situations, and their own lives and well-being and that of their families at risk, and so we give you thanks for the work that they do. We pray that you continue to protect and guide them in making difficult decisions, often in difficult situations, and that all of us together can do better, that we can continue to improve the ways in which we create a community that serves the greater good and the good for all of our citizens. Be with us tonight as we go from this place. Keep us safe and in your care until we meet again. We pray in your name. Amen. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. And thanks to Connor and Michael for the live stream and getting us online tonight. Thanks.